All right, so if you watch the video, you know that this lady is not actually in it. This is just another segment within the larger video. But so when I first saw that video, I thought that was really interesting that they had devised a way to, pair the visual with a sound pattern, and that the little boy with dyslexia had like almost near impossible time following the pattern, whereas his age cohort without dyslexia was able to breeze through it like it was a really easy task. And so it really kind of drives home that there's more going on than the stereotype of dyslexia, where we say, oh, the words are flipped, or the letters are flipped, or the letters are mixed up in the word, and other things. The things that we say about what dyslexia is not necessarily representative of what it's defined as. All right, whoops, don't start the video. There we go. Okay. So where in the brain would we say dyslexia is housed? So just a legend at the top right here. I put CA on the label on the pictures. It's labeled CA. That means age matched. So they're being matched for chronological age is what the CA stands for. RL means that they're being matched for reading levels. That's what the R and the L stand for, is reading level. And the DYS is referring to a person with dyslexia. So now these are what we call functional MRIs. And just, I want to make sure to manage your expectations. Just because it's a functional MRI, it looks like really super scientific and we know what we're talking about. What we're looking at here is if it's gray, as in they have not imposed any color coding onto it, that means that there were no differences or unusual patterns of activity in those regions of the brain. So in those parts that are gray, the brain looks like it would when you're not reading. So it's been sort of canceled out. If it's blue, there's some activity. If you're in the reds, oranges, yellows, there's a lot of activity. So it's the normal kind of gradation where bluer colors mean less hot or activity, and reds and yellows and stuff, that means more activity. Okay, so in the top left panel of the picture, it's labeled A. It says underneath it whole group. So these are just the average across everybody who participated. These are the areas of the brain that were what we like to call active or hot during a reading activity, during sentence reading in this case. And so on the left-hand side of panel A, you see the left hemisphere of the brain. And you see some structures that are really hot. They're orange and yellow, right? I don't know if you can see my arrow. I hope so. I thought I told the system to recognize it. But towards the back, that would be the occipital lobe. And that's the part of the brain that's actually recognizing the words as they're coming in. Then we have a little structure next to it that's called the angular gyrus that's actually reading the words out loud so that then they can be recognized by Wernicke's area. And ultimately we have the frontal lobe that's getting involved in recognizing the grammar and other things. You'll notice a little bit of activity in other places, the blue places and things. Those play ancillary roles, they think, but it's not really super clear. What you'll notice is that the right hemisphere of the brain, which is on the right-hand side of the panel A, that doesn't have much activity going on at all in the right side of the brain. The right side of the brain is not very involved in reading. Almost everything that's going on with reading is going to happen on the left side. Almost everything that's going on with language in general is going to happen on the left side of the brain. Now, if we look at the chronological age matched, which is panel B at the bottom left, you'll see that in the left hemisphere, we see some activity that is going on in the left hemisphere of the chronologically age matched people that's not present in the dyslexic people. So we're seeing a little, what you would say is in the dyslexic person, you would have less activity in certain regions of the brain during a reading task. In the top right, we have chronological age match versus reading level match, and you'll see there's no differences between groups at all. If they're the same chronological age and they're at the same reading level, you see no differences, like it's all gray. If you look in the bottom right and it's labeled D, you see that the reading level match against a dyslexic person, you're seeing more activity in the left hemisphere in certain areas among the people who are at the same reading level, but aren't dyslexic on both the left and the right hemisphere of the brain. So there are certain areas of the brain that are more active in a person who reads well, that are not active in a person who has dyslexia. So now these are a lot of really sort of random, discrete areas of the brain. So this, just seeing it as a picture, you've got to be really careful that you can't say what exactly this means. We don't know exactly what this means. All we know is that there are some signs in the brain and how the brain is being used that help to support a diagnosis of dyslexia, that clearly the person is using their brain differently during a sentence reading task than a person who is, at their same reading level, but is reading, doesn't have dyslexia. So kind of an interesting little topic to kind of think about, like, where would it be in your brain? What we would like to think is that there's one spot. And so far, evidence is not suggesting that it's one spot. All right, so shifting off from dyslexia into just sort of standard, how do we teach reading? I kind of alluded to this a little earlier when I was talking about the theories of, the indirect access theory versus direct access theory. There are different ways to teach reading. The whole word method says we should learn the actual words by sort of basically rote memorization. And this would be a top-down process where you are recognizing words that you've seen before. One of the things that they do in whole word language, whole word training is they have the budding reader actually take a pencil and like trace the shape of the word so that they just get really familiar with what it looks like, because the goal is to learn to just recognize it on the fly, recognize it quickly so that you can recognize, oh, that's the word the, or that's the word wrote, or that's the word down. And not have to really sound it out or think about it. Just basically you can just recognize it. Phonics, on the other hand, tries to teach an understanding of the relationship between the letters that make up the words and then the sounds that those letters make, so that you can ultimately map out the sounds directly to the letters, right? And this is a very much bottom-up process. So each element is sort of processed individually at the beginning, where you're really learning how to sound it out. Now, with practice, remember we've talked about, automaticity and how, if you've really overlearned something, you can get to the point where you can do it without thinking. The assumption is with phonics that, if you've been reading and you've been seeing these words a lot, ultimately you'll get to the point where you are not sounding them out. You're just going to be recognizing them too. But the way that you get to the recognition is different with phonics versus whole word, right? Whole word, you go right to, let's just recognize the word. With phonics, it's teaching you how to sound out words so that if you do encounter a new word that you've never seen before, you can sound it out, compare it to things you might have heard, and see if you don't actually recognize that word after all. So phonics is a much more bottom-up process with the goal of you ultimately transitioning into a top-down process. Now with whole language, you're supposed to guess at unfamiliar words using context. This is a top-down process again, where based on the other words that you've recognized in the sentence, if you come upon a word that you've never seen before, well, you know what? Guess what it might be. The context of the sentence may have led you to a pretty good conclusion about what the word might be. So typically, the research is showing that you end up with better readers over time if you train with the phonics method, if you can train using, the sounding out method. Now, I'm saying this with a little bit of hesitation because some of you may have had the experience, and your parents might back you up on this, of sort of not really knowing how you learn to read. Like one day you could just read. For some people, that's how it is. They don't really have to work at it. They don't really struggle with it. It just, one day they can read. Other people have to, they really earn every word that they learn. Like they really have to work at it. And I have one of each of those kinds of readers in my children. I have two kids. One just one day could read. And I'm like, how did you learn to read, kid? I was not trying to teach her how to read. She was little and she was still at home. She wasn't in school yet. And I thought just had memorized the book, which I thought was a pretty good memory feat. But when she was in first grade, the teacher pointed out, what's the difference between memory and reading anyway? And I'm like, well, that's actually a pretty good point. So she entered kindergarten reading at a third grade level, and I hadn't taught her to read. I wasn't trying to teach her to read. She loved to be read to, but I don't even think I pointed at the words or anything. I don't know how she figured it out. And apparently that's how I learned to read. I don't remember exactly, but apparently my parents put exactly as much effort into teaching me to read, and I could read also before I went to school. My brother and my son very much were very similar in that they were not like that. They had to be taught to read. And I tried a lot of different approaches with my son, trying to help him to learn to read. I tried the whole word method where I tried to help him to recognize. I tried the whole language method where I was like, okay, you recognize these words. Now, what do you think this one is? And he would get so frustrated and didn't even want to guess. And what he really liked the best was figuring out the rules. Like, he wanted the rules to guide him. And so we focused in on phonics, and had different strategies for teaching him a phonics-based method. And ultimately he did learn to read. It took him so much longer to learn to read. I mean, I had him finally reading at grade level when he was in 6th grade. Like, I couldn't have had more inverted kids where one was this way and one was that way. But I finally had him by 6th grade reading at grade level, which in his day and age, the school system was very irritated because they were practicing the No Child Left Behind motto, and he was supposed to be reading by 4th grade, gosh darn it. And it's like, well, he's not ready. So he finally was on grade level by 6th grade, and really I attributed any of it to phonics because it made it possible for him to be willing to sound it out on his own. But ultimately, to become a decent reader, you have to move past sounding out words and start, guessing at unfamiliar words in context, recognizing words that you're familiar with. So it really ultimately becomes, no matter what kind of training you had, a combination of all three of these things that will make you a good reader. Like, we all come upon words that we've never seen before, and we're going to have to sound them out. We're going to have to guess based on based on the context, and figure out what could this possibly be. You probably have a lot of that experience with college textbooks because you come upon words that you have never seen before, and you're like, holy cow, what is this word? And sometimes they're kind of made up words. So even if you look it up in the dictionary is like, I don't know what that word is, because it's sort of like just unique to that field that you're studying. And so you probably get to feel a little bit like a first grader again when you're in college trying to figure out what these words are. I personally feel like that's part of what college is about, is trying to, broaden your vocabulary. I know when I was in college, I had to go home and look things up all the time that I heard in lecture. It's very normal. Even when you're a good reader or you have a lot of experience with a lot of words, you meet new people who know more words and you internalize them into your vocabulary, right? Like, that's how your vocabulary grows. So I just want to really encourage you, if you were taught with any of these methods, that doesn't mean anything about, how well you end up reading in the long run, really, because it's about, practice. Reading a lot is the only way to become a better reader. A lot of people tell me, well, I'm too slow of a reader, so I don't like to read. And my son really still doesn't like to read. He tends to listen to books on tape rather than read because he's like, I'm just so slow. But practice is really the only way to stop being slow. Like, that really is the only way to get past it. So practice makes progress. So anyway, now some of the benefits of phonics. On average, kids, while they're still in the kid level, tend to, score higher on reading, on spelling, on comprehension of what they read. So those are benefits. These benefits are really consistent with the indirect access theory of, reading acquisition. So, as a way to sort of maybe take people who are not reading well or are really struggling to begin their reading journey, phonics makes a lot of sense. I'll just say, as a buyer beware idea on this, though, man, English is tough because there are a lot of words that don't follow the rules for pronunciation. So it's very frustrating in a lot of ways if you're learning the rules that EA sounds like E, and then you read the word bread and you go, what is that? Why does that not follow the rules? It can be very frustrating, that's for sure. But, everything that's new is, when you're acquiring a new skill, is always challenging. So anyway, so let's stop here and we'll come back and talk about some myths about reading and so on. So I'll see you in the next segment.